The last thing I remember before my knees hit that marble floor was Patricia's voice snapping, "Get this trash out of my building." And then the sharp crack of glass as my mother's framed photograph hit the ground and shattered. And while I was on my hands and knees trying to scoop up pieces of my parents' faces, people in suits were laughing and filming me like I was some kind of circus act. And the wild part is, they had no idea the crazy woman in the old cardigan owned more of that company than all of them put together. My name is Autumn, and if you've ever been underestimated, written off, or treated like you were nothing because of how you look, you're going to feel this in your bones, because I wasn't just the CEO's wife. I was the hidden majority shareholder of Sterling Industries, my father's company. And the day those executives decided to step on my mother's picture with their heels was the day I stopped being invisible and burned their little empire down from the inside. So let me take you back to how all of this started, because none of it happened overnight. My father, Daniel Harris, built Sterling Industries from scratch, 30 years of late nights and cheap coffee and handwritten notes that turned into contracts. He designed that 60-story glass tower himself. Every line of it, and when he died 2 years ago, he left me 40% of the company, not because I loved business, but because he trusted me to protect what he'd built. My husband Christopher was already the CEO by then, with 35% of the shares. The board held the other 25%, and on paper, if you added us together, we controlled everything. But almost nobody knew that, because my dad kept my ownership quiet, buried in legal documents that only he, our lawyer, Mr. Franklin, and Christopher really read. After the funeral, when the casseroles were still crowding our kitchen counter, and I was moving through the house like a ghost, Christopher took my hands, looked me in the eyes, and said, "You've been through enough. Autumn, let me handle the boardrooms and the sharks. You stay out of it, okay? Just live peacefully." And honestly, that sounded like a relief, because I hated the idea of fighting with a bunch of old men over balance sheets. I liked my books, my garden, my mother's recipes, the quiet life, so I let him carry that part of our world, and I stayed small on purpose. For a while it felt fine, or at least normal then. About 6 months before that lobby scene, I started noticing small things that didn't feel like us, like Christopher coming home later. And later his tie loosened. His eyes glazed in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. His kisses landing somewhere near my cheek instead of on it. His phone suddenly living face down, always on silent. And when I'd ask how things were going, he'd say, "Complicated, but you don't need to worry about it." Then change the subject, and I'd swallow my questions, because I didn't want to be that wife, you know what I mean. 3 days before everything exploded, I was in his study looking for a pen, and I found a thick envelope half tucked behind some files in the bottom drawer of his desk. A place he never randomly stuffed things. And when I opened it, my hands already felt cold. Inside were divorce papers. My name, his name, our marriage laid out like a business deal, assets carefully sliced up, my future, mapped in legal language. I hadn't agreed to, they weren't signed yet, but they were ready, and I just stood there in that quiet room that still smelled like his cologne, staring at a life he was planning, without me. I didn't confront him that night. Some instinct said, "Don't scream, don't give him a heads up, just watch." And that instinct saved me, because that same evening, I logged into our accounts. Our joint savings that we'd built for 10 years was empty. Our emergency fund gone, my personal account frozen. And when I used my shareholder credentials to log into the company system for the first time in my life, I saw something even worse. Millions of dollars moved out of Sterling into offshore accounts over and over again, and a set of transfer documents in progress that would move my 40% out of my name using a signature that looked like mine but wasn't. That was the first time I stopped feeling sad and started feeling alert like I was standing in a house where the walls were quietly on fire, and everyone else was pretending not to smell smoke. The next morning, Christopher was rushing around early, talking on the phone, muttering about a $200 million merger that was closing that day. And after he left, I wandered into his office, and there, sitting openly on his desk like a prop left in the middle of a stage, were the original merger documents, the ones he needed to finalize that deal. And you have to understand, Christopher never forgot anything that mattered. This man remembers what you ordered at dinner 3 years ago. He does not forget a contract worth $200 million. So when I saw that folder, I knew it was either a test or a trap, but I still picked it up. I put the documents into my mother's old canvas tote, the one I'd been using for years. And because I'm me, I also slipped in a handful of framed photographs I carry like talismans. My father in a hard hat in front of the unfinished Sterling Tower, my mother laughing in her garden. Their wedding photo, one of me on my dad's shoulders as a kid, legs wrapped around his neck, while he pointed at blueprints on a folding table. I got dressed the way I always do when I'm not thinking about anyone's opinion. Comfortable jeans, worn sneakers, my mom's old cardigan that still smelled faintly like her perfume. If you pressed your nose to the collar, I twisted my hair into a ponytail, no makeup, no jewelry, and since Christopher claimed he needed our driver for company errands, I took the subway, sitting among people heading to regular jobs, clutching that tote in my lap, and convincing myself maybe this was a chance to fix things, deliver the papers, talk, maybe save our marriage before it went up in flames. Sterling Industries Tower looked like it always does, too shiny, too tall, my father's name etched in metal over the entrance. And as I walked up to those revolving doors, my heart was pounding, not because I was intimidated by the building, but because I was about to step into my husband's world uninvited. The second I stepped inside, one of the security guards peeled away from his post. Big guy, shaved head, cold eyes. His badge said Bruno Martinez, and he planted himself in front of me like I was carrying a bomb. "Loading docks in the back, cleaning lady," he said like it was a joke he'd made 100 times. It took me a second to catch up. "Oh no, I'm not staff," I said, holding the tote a little tighter. "I'm here to see Christopher Bennett. I have important documents he left at home. They have to be signed today." He actually laughed, pressed his radio and said, "We got a live one up front, claims she's here for the CEO." Static and laughter crackled back through the speaker, and within moments 2 more guards walked up, forming a half circle that made it clear they could move me wherever they wanted. "Ma'am, you need to leave before we make you leave." One of them said that bored tone people use when they've already decided who you are. "Just call his office." I tried again, trying to keep my voice respectful even though my stomach was twisting. "Tell them Autumn is here, he'll know, I promise." "Autumn," Bruno repeated, eyebrows up. "That your street name?" And the other guards snorted, like that was the funniest thing they'd heard all week. That's when I heard the sound of expensive heels on marble, sharp and fast, and 3 executives appeared like they'd been summoned. Patricia, the COO in a sleek pantsuit, Harold, the CFO, silver hair, smug smile, and Diane, VP of Operations, in a dress that basically screamed, "I'm important." They looked exactly like their headshots on the company website, except up close their eyes were colder. Patricia's nose wrinkled the second she saw me, and she turned to security and said, "Why is there a homeless woman loitering on our leather couch?" Which was hilarious, because I wasn't even near the couch, I was literally standing in the middle of the lobby. I took a breath and stepped toward them, because I still believed stupidly that if I just explained clearly, they'd listen. "Hi," I said. "I'm Autumn Bennett. I'm here to see my husband, Christopher. I have the merger documents. He forgot they're time-sensitive. I just need to get them to him." Harold let out this short, disbelieving laugh and looked at Patricia. "Bennett, huh, that's rich," he said. You stalking our CEO now, sweetheart, trying on his last name in public. I'm his wife, I said, feeling my throat tighten. We've been married 8 years. He left these at home. I'm just trying to help. All three of them started laughing, like I'd told the best joke of their morning. Diane actually wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. Christopher Bennett's wife doesn't take the subway, she said finally, gesturing at my outfit with one manicured hand. And she definitely doesn't wear whatever that is. Listen, honey, whatever fantasy you've built about him, that's over, you need to leave. I tried again. Please just call him or his assistant. I can show you my ID, I can… But Patricia cut me off with a sharp, "No, what you can do is stop trespassing in my lobby before I have you arrested." When I reached into my tote to pull out the folder, Harold lunged forward, grabbed the entire bag out of my hands, and turned it upside down like he was dumping out a trash can. The merger documents slid across the floor, followed by all those framed photographs, glass hitting marble, the sound of my past shattering in public. He bent down and picked up a picture of my father standing in front of Sterling's steel skeleton, wearing his hard hat crooked. "Oh my God," Harold said, holding it up between two fingers, voice dripping with mockery. "She's got fan photos of our founder. This is not just a stalker. This is an obsessed stalker." "That's my dad," I whispered, my knees already buckling as I reached for the other frames. "Please be careful. That's all I have left of them." Diane took the photo from him, held it up like she was checking the lighting, then looked straight at me, let the frame fall to the floor, and stepped on it, with her heel grinding it, until I heard the glass crack, until I saw a jagged line slice through my father's face. It felt like she had stomped on my chest. I dropped fully to my knees, trying to gather photos with shaking hands. My mom's smiling face smeared with dirt from their shoes, edges of pictures bent and torn. People were starting to gather around us, phones coming out, a murmur building like a wave. Harold reached past me and snatched the merger documents off the floor. "Well, well," he said, voice loud enough to carry, "looks like she didn't just stalk, she stole. These are classified company files. Sweetheart, you're going to jail today." "I didn't steal anything," I said, tears burning hot. "Christopher left them at home. I brought them to him, that's all." Diane threw her hands up and called out, "This is corporate espionage, call the police." And a few people actually clapped like this was some kind of live show. I begged them, "Please, just let me call him. Let me call my husband. He'll explain it." And that's when Patricia lifted her phone, but instead of dialing, she snapped a picture of me on my knees, destroyed photos around me, and I watched her thumbs move as she typed, then hit send. Within seconds, I heard notification pings around the lobby, people looking at their screens, then at me, then laughing, and later I'd see the screenshot of what she posted in the company chat. A photo of me and the caption, "Crazy stalker tried to infiltrate the building. LOL security handled it." A young receptionist, Maya, who couldn't have been more than 22, stepped out from behind the front desk, eyes wide, and said softly, "Ms. Shaw, maybe we should at least call Mr. Bennett's office to verify. It would take 2 seconds." Patricia turned on her so fast, it was like she'd been waiting for someone to push back. "Maya, you're fired," she snapped. "Pack your desk hand and your badge right now." I watched the color drain from the girl's face as she realized she had just lost her job for suggesting they double-check the truth, and something inside me wanted to scream. But before I could say anything, Bruno grabbed my arm hard enough to tear the cardigan sleeve. Another guard grabbed the other, and they started dragging me toward the doors, my knees scraping across the polished floor, skin splitting, blood streaking behind us, while people filmed on their phones and shouted things like "World Star," like I was a viral clip waiting to happen. They didn't walk me out gently. They literally threw me through the open glass doors. I landed on the concrete. On my hands and knees, palms, shredded jeans, ripped my mother's cardigan, hanging half off my shoulder, And behind me I heard the doors slide shut, with that soft final sound. When I looked up through the glass, I saw Patricia and Harold and Diane high-fiving in the lobby, like they had just crushed a problem, not a person. I sat there shaking, pulled out my phone with trembling fingers, and called Christopher. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I hung up and called again. This time I watched "call declined" pop up on the screen. He saw my name and actively chose not to answer. My chest got tight. I texted him, "Chris, I'm hurt. Your team just threw me out. I have your documents." And a few seconds later I saw "delivered" under the message, then "read," and then silence, nothing, not even a what. That was the moment the blinders came off. I opened our banking app again on the sidewalk and saw zeros where savings used to be. I checked my personal account, and it was still frozen. I logged into the shareholder portal and saw the transfer of my 40% sitting there, forged, backdated, already moving, and suddenly the forgotten documents and the missing driver and the perfectly timed executives and the phone calls. He wasn't answering, all snapped together like a puzzle I didn't want to solve. He wanted me to walk into that lobby looking like someone no one would respect. He wanted me humiliated and broken so that when he served those divorce papers, I'd sign anything to make the pain stop. He wanted my shares more than he wanted my life with him, and everyone in that building was happy to help him do it. I looked up and caught my reflection in a dark store window across the street, a woman in a ripped cardigan, blood on her knee, mascara smudged. And I realized every person who had laughed at me only saw that version, not the woman whose name sat on 40% of their company, not the founder's daughter who'd been polite enough to stay in the background. And I thought, okay, if they want to see who I really am, I'll show them. I scrolled through my contacts and tapped a number. I hadn't called since my father's funeral. When Mr. Franklin answered, his voice was cautious and warm all at once. "Autumn, are you all right?" And I said very calmly, "No, but I will be. I need emergency board papers. I need every document proving my ownership. And I need you to call federal auditors because my husband and his friends are stealing from my father's company, and I'm done pretending I don't see it." There was a little pause, and then he said, "Once we do this, there's no hiding you anymore. The whole company will know exactly who you are." And I said, "Good, they've been stomping on my parents' faces without even knowing who they were. It's time they learned." He told me he'd be there in 20 minutes. He showed up in 15 black luxury car, pulling up to the curb. He stepped out with 2 other lawyers from his firm, took one look at my torn cardigan and bleeding knee, and his jaw set in a way I'd only seen when my dad was alive and about to go to war for something. "Did they do this to you?" he asked, and I just nodded and said, "Take pictures, we're filing assault charges." One lawyer started photographing my injuries and the rip in my sleeve. The other handed me a garment bag and my father's old leather briefcase. "Your dad kept a spare suit in his office," Franklin said quietly. "I thought you might want it." I changed in the back seat of that car like I was shedding a skin, carefully taking off the ripped cardigan and folding it, wiping the blood from my knee as best I could. Sliding into my father's gray suit, which fit me almost perfectly because somewhere along the line I had quietly grown into his height and shoulders. I tied my hair back tighter, looked in the rearview mirror, and watched my face shift from broken to something harder, calmer. The softness still there, but covered now by something that looked a lot like resolve. And in that moment, I stopped feeling like a victim outside my own building and started feeling like exactly what I was, the majority shareholder walking into her company. When I stepped out of the car and walked back up those steps, people on the sidewalk actually moved out of my way without being asked. Bruno saw me coming through the glass and started to step forward like he was going to block me again. But Franklin got to the door first and said in that very polite lawyer tone, Mr. Martinez, if you lay a hand on Mrs. Bennett again, you'll be doing it in front of a judge. We have hospital photos, we have witnesses, and your own security footage, so if I were you, I'd let her pass. Bruno's hands dropped to his sides. I walked right by him without giving him the satisfaction of eye contact. The lobby that had been full of laughter earlier went quiet. People were whispering, phones came out again. But now they were trying to figure out who the woman in the sharp suit was. I walked straight to the executive elevator, the one I'd never used, the one labeled for C-suite access only, my heels clicking now where my knees had been dragged. And when Diane stepped in front of it and started, "You can't just waltz into that elevator, it's for executives," and I looked her dead in the eye and said one word, "Move." And the way she physically flinched and stepped aside without thinking told me everything I needed to know about how thin her power really was. Upstairs, I didn't knock on Christopher's office door. I opened it because it was my father's building, my father's floor, and my company. And of course, I walked in on him with Veronica from marketing, sitting on his desk, her hand on his chest, his lips on hers. They jerked apart like guilty teenagers, faces draining when they saw Franklin and the other lawyers behind me. "Autumn, what are you doing here? Why are you dressed like that? How did you even get past security?" he stammered. And I set my father's briefcase on his desk, opened it, and laid out a neat stack of folders in front of him. "These," I said, my voice steady, "are notices of federal investigation for fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. They're addressed to you, to Patricia, to Harold, to Diane, and depending on what else we uncover, maybe more people. Did you really think you could steal from my father's company, fake my signature, bleed this place dry, and I wouldn't notice forever?" He tried to reach for me instead of the papers, saying, "I can explain you love me. We've been together 8 years. You don't want to do this. We can work this out." And I just looked at him and said, "Explain it to them," and nodded at the door, where Franklin opened it wider, and 3 federal agents in dark suits walked in, badges flashing, calling him by his full name and telling him not to leave the city. I let them talk. I let the silence stretch after. Then I asked him quietly, "Did you love me when you forged my name, when you emptied our accounts, when you planned to have your own wife humiliated and thrown bleeding onto the street, so she'd sign anything you put in front of her? Did you love me then?" And the fact that he didn't answer said more than any speech could. We called an emergency board meeting, and 20 minutes later, I was walking into a room full of people who had technically been working for me this entire time without knowing it. They looked annoyed at being pulled in on short notice, confused when they saw me at the head seat. The chairman, George, frowned and said, "Who are you and where is Christopher?" And I said, "He's currently downstairs with federal agents." "I'm Autumn Bennett. I own 40% of Sterling Industries. My father founded this company, and I am exercising my rights as majority shareholder." There was noise, pushback. George insisting that those shares had been transferred, and Franklin calmly sliding evidence in front of each board member, showing them that the transfer documents were forged, my signature, faked the move legally, void. Then he laid out the proxy agreements from 2 major shareholders who had thrown their votes behind me, pushing my control above 50%. And in that moment, the power in the room shifted. You could feel it, like the air changed temperature. I didn't yell, I didn't threaten. I just said clearly that I was removing Christopher as CEO, terminating Patricia, Harold, Diane, and Bruno for cause with no severance, and that anyone who had a problem with cleaning out corruption and abuse could submit their resignation, and we'd process it by end of day. And funny thing, nobody stood up. When I came back down to the lobby, the place was packed. Word had spread. There were news vans outside, police cars, agents, employees crowding every railing, and in the middle of it all stood Patricia and Harold and Diane with security around them, faces pale. No smiles, no phones out. This time someone handed me a microphone and the whole lobby went quiet. I told them exactly what had happened, how I had walked in that morning, in my dead mother's cardigan, carrying documents, and the last physical memories of my parents. How I had been mocked, called crazy, and homeless, and delusional, how they had ripped my cardigan, ground my mother's picture into the marble, dragged me across that floor, until my knees bled and my palms tore, and how they had turned my pain into a joke to pass around on their internal chat while they high-fived each other. I told them I was not a stalker, not a random intruder. I was the founder's daughter and their boss's wife, and more importantly, I was the woman who owned the building they had just thrown me out of. Then I looked at Patricia and Harold and Diane and said, "You are all fired effective immediately, and you'll be dealing with criminal charges, not just unemployment." And I turned to the crowd and said, "But I also want you to see what happens when somebody chooses kindness instead of cruelty." I called Maya's name, the young receptionist who had tried to speak up, and she stepped forward, clutching a cardboard box with her things in it, eyes red and in front of everyone. I offered her a new job as my executive assistant on the 60th floor starting Monday, with a salary that made her jaw drop. And the way the employees cheered in that moment told me I wasn't the only one who'd been watching how people were treated around there. As the federal agents led Patricia and Harold and Diane and finally Christopher through the lobby toward waiting cars, news cameras recording every step. Christopher looked back at me and tried one last time. "Autumn, please, I'm sorry, we can fix this." And I walked close enough that only he could hear and said, "You're not sorry you hurt me. You're sorry you got caught. You thought I was weak and stupid and invisible, but you forgot one thing. I'm my father's daughter, and he did not build this place by being weak." Then I nodded to the agents and let them take him away. A week later, I was sitting in my father's old office, now mine, his coffee mug still on the shelf, his favorite pen on the desk, his business license on the wall, and next to it my mother's cardigan, cleaned, repaired, framed a reminder of who I am and where I came from. Franklin came in with updates about charges and plea deals and the company's stock climbing, now that investors saw corruption being cut out at the root. And I remember saying, "You know what? The wildest part is, if they had just been kind, if they had just checked my ID, made one phone call, treated me like a human being, instead of a joke, none of this would have happened. They'd still have their jobs." Christopher might have gotten away with this for a lot longer, but they were so sure a woman in old clothes was nobody that they destroyed themselves. And he just nodded and said, "Cruelty has a way of doing that." Later that day, I took the subway home in jeans and a simple sweater, no makeup, hair, and a ponytail, just another woman on a train. I helped a stranger wrestle her grocery bags up the stairs, and she thanked me like I'd done something huge. And I thought if she knew I was technically worth $500 million, would she treat me differently? Would she suddenly think my help meant more? And I realized that's the heart of it. Kindness doesn't cost more if you give it to someone. In old clothes, respect doesn't become more real because somebody wears a designer suit. So if you're still here with me, I want to ask you something and be honest in the comments. Do you think I went too far pressing charges and making sure those people lost everything, or do you think they wrote their own ending, the second they stomped on a grieving woman's family photos and laughed? Have you ever been judged or humiliated because of how you looked, or watched someone in power tear someone down just because they could tell me your story? I read every single one. And if this hit you at all, hit like, hit subscribe, share this with someone who needs a reminder that the nobody they're stepping on might be the one signing their paycheck or deciding one day to take it away.